You won't believe what happened when a soldier pulled a Bigfoot out of the mud. Deep in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas, a war-weary man named Caleb March lived alone in a forest cabin. No family, no friends, just silence and trees. One morning, in the thick spring fog, he heard a cry from the valley. There, sinking fast in the mud, was something massive, something alive. Caleb didn't run. He reached for a rope. What he pulled out wasn't just a creature. It was the beginning of a bond. In the days that followed, they exchanged no words, only quiet gestures. Stacked firewood, folded blankets, gifts left under the pines. But when poachers returned with guns, it was the Bigfoot who stepped forward to protect a human child. A monster or a guardian? This is the kind of story people laugh off until they hear it from the man who lived it. If you're still here, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment. Let's see how far this story of silent kindness can go. From the heart of the forest to you. With warmth, thank you for being here. In the soggy hush of an Arkansas morning in early spring, the land still bore the weight of the storm from the night before. Rainwater clung to the grass like sweat on skin, and the low fog over the Ouachita foothills made everything look older, slower. Caleb March, 56, stirred in his creaking bed as though he'd been listening to the silence shift. His knees cracked like thawing ice when he swung his legs over the edge, but he didn't curse or wince, just sat there a moment, shoulders hunched, hands resting on his thighs, letting his breath catch up to his bones. He moved with the careful rhythm of someone who knew every board in the floor by its squeak. In the kitchen, the percolator coughed into life, the smell of weak black coffee filling the room like old tobacco smoke. He took it plain, stomach too fussy these days for anything bold. Outside, the air smelled of cedar bark and wet earth. Caleb took his time lacing his boots, tucking his cuffs just right, then slung an old axe across one shoulder and a coil of rope over the other. Same path, same steps. Habit was the only company that never changed its tune. His boots squelched through patches of damp ground as he headed down toward the tree line. Every sound in the woods that morning rang louder than usual. The snap of a twig, the slow drip of water off pine needles. A jay somewhere off to the left let out a shriek, like it had just remembered something terrible. Caleb paused, not because of the bird, but because beneath all that noise there came something else. A groan, long, low, staggered. Not quite animal, not quite human either. Something in between, like a breath dragged through rusted chains. He stood still, squinting into the fog. Listened again. It came from the lower edge of the hollow, where the grass thickened near the runoff pools. Caleb stepped carefully, brushing past clumps of wet switchgrass, knees still sore but steady. As he drew closer, the sound grew heavier, labored, like something alive was being slowly buried under its own weight. That's when he saw it. A pit of mud, wide and dark, with rain still trickling down its edges. And in the middle of it, something massive. Trapped up to the chest, arms spread just above the surface, matted with dirt and grit. Its fur looked slick and dark as wet bark, shoulders broader than anything should be, the shape unmistakably wrong for bear or cow. What stopped Caleb wasn't the size, it was the eyes. Amber brown, like creek water catching the first touch of morning sun, and so full of weariness he almost turned and left right then. Not fear, not rage, just the kind of exhaustion you see in men who've stopped praying. Caleb didn't speak. Not at first. He stood a moment longer, calculating the wind, the angle, his own pulse. Then he took a step back, found a sturdy hickory nearby, and wrapped the rope around its base. Knotted it once, twice. Then he uncoiled the rest, steadied himself, and swung the loop toward the center of the mire. It landed short. The creature didn't move. He tried again. This time, the loop fell closer. Caleb called out, Not with command, not with panic, but with the slow, steady tone of someone coaxing a frightened colt. "Come on now," he said, voice low. "Take it." The creature's hand moved, large, human-like, but thick with coarse fur. It reached, missed, tried again. The rope slipped through once more. Caleb braced harder, knelt into the mud's edge, leaned his weight into the trunk behind him. On the third try, the hand gripped. The earth groaned under the pull. Caleb's boots slid, bit in. He shifted his footing, wrapped the rope once around a fallen limb for leverage. Muscles in his back screamed old protests. The creature began to crawl, inch by agonizing inch, its limbs trembling from more than just fatigue. The muck made wet sucking sounds, releasing its prize in grudging spasms. At one point, the weight dragged Caleb forward so violently that his chin struck bark, but he held. When it was finally free, the thing collapsed just past the edge of the pit, steam rising from its back. Its body heaved, chest rattling with effort. Caleb stepped away slowly, arms hanging limp, covered in mud up to the elbows. His beard was flecked with it, and the metallic taste of swamp water clung to his tongue. He spat into the grass, then looked back. The creature didn't move, except for breathing. Not once did it look toward him with anger. Just stillness, like it had given all it had, even to survive. Only then did Caleb notice something else. A few feet away from the pit's rim, the earth had been disturbed. Small broken stakes, sharpened crudely at the ends, stuck out at awkward angles. Not random, not from a fall. These had been placed there, intended for something, or someone. Caleb didn't touch them, just looked. Then looked back at the creature lying still as a toppled log, its eyes half closed. He exhaled through his nose, slow and quiet, like a man slipping a stone into his pocket he didn't yet understand the weight of. He didn't speak, didn't try to offer comfort. He just nodded once, more to himself than anything, and turned back toward the cabin. The morning had grown no warmer, but he felt the sweat chilling down his spine. By the time he stepped onto his porch again, the coffee was cold in its mug. He didn't warm it. He sat, listened. The forest was quiet behind him, but not empty. Something had changed, not out loud, but somewhere deep, like the soft shift of timbers under a house that's settling into new ground. That night, Caleb left a wool blanket folded at the edge of the tree line. Not close enough to intrude, just enough to say, "I saw you." I didn't run. He didn't expect it to be taken, but he didn't expect it to be left either. And in the morning, when he stepped onto the porch once more, there it was, folded back again, neat as hospital corners. Right beside it, a bundle of small sticks, arranged in a perfect line, shortest to longest. It didn't make sense, sir, but it did. He stared at it a long time, that quiet message shaped out of twigs and silence. The sun rose late that day. Cloud cover held on to the night longer than it should have, and when it finally lifted, the light had a dull gold to it, like something old trying to remember how to shine. Out past the hollow, the trees whispered, not in warning, in memory, and somewhere deep in his bones, Caleb March knew. Whatever he'd pulled out of that mire, it hadn't just been a creature. Something else had surfaced too. Something that had been asleep in him for a long, long time. The kind of knowing that doesn't come with words. The kind that only makes sense when the forest itself seems to hold its breath. And waits. The fire crackled slow and steady under a lean-to of damp pine twigs, burning just hot enough to keep the chill from creeping too close. Caleb had built it with purpose, far enough not to crowd, near enough for warmth. The light from the flames flickered across wet bark and moss-covered stone, casting long, quiet shadows that didn't dare move unless the wind stirred them. A dented tin pot of water sat on the edge of the coals, barely whispering its simmer, and beside it, 2 broken pieces of cornbread, dry from time but still edible. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He just placed them gently in reach, turned his back to the creature lying a few yards off, and sat down slow, facing the dark woods, hands folded in his lap like a man waiting on a train that might not come. Behind him, there was the soft scrape of movement on damp leaves. Not the kind that startled, the kind that asked permission, the kind that a wounded thing makes when it's deciding whether or not to try again. Caleb didn't turn. His body stayed still, but his ears caught every shift. The low breath, the shallow grunt, the uncertain pull of muscle against pain. Then came the slosh of water from the tin, the cautious lapping of someone too weak to drink fast, followed by a long pause. Then the faintest rustle of fingers against paper-thin cornbread, a bite that sounded more like an apology than hunger. He didn't look. He just listened. And the forest listened with him. Time passed. The fire dropped to glowing coals. The wind picked up a little, tugging the tops of the pines like they were being reminded of something they didn't want to remember. Caleb stood finally, joints stiff but mind alert. He left a wool blanket folded at the edge of the brush, not close enough to touch, just there. Then he walked back toward his cabin in silence, boots pressing prints into wet soil that would vanish by morning. The rain came light that night, a soft misting kind that clung to glass like breath. Caleb watched it hit the window once he was home, seated at his table with an old book in front of him and his mind far from its pages. The coffee had gone cold again. He didn't reheat it. He just sat there, the way folks sit when they've witnessed something they know the world wouldn't believe if told. In the early hours, just before first light, he stepped onto the porch, not expecting much, not really searching. But what he found waiting made his hands still at his sides. The blanket had not been taken. It had been folded back, neatly, edges aligned like someone had run their finger along them. And beside it, a collection of sticks, 7 in total, lined up from smallest to largest. Not thrown, not scattered, arranged. Caleb stood there in his flannel shirt and wool socks, breath steaming, staring at that quiet answer shaped out of order. It said more than words ever could. It said, "I heard you." That day, he went into town. The rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung low, dragging across the tops of the hills like smoke from an old fire. At the ranger outpost, he picked up supplies. Salt, a new bar of lye soap, a box of nails he didn't need but might. That's where he ran into Tess Lanier. 24, fresh from somewhere else, still wore clean boots, still smiled like nothing in the woods could ever mean harm. She asked if he'd heard the talk. Said someone had been losing pets, dogs mostly, a few goats. Said she'd seen signs of snares deeper in the woods than folks usually set them. Caleb nodded slow, not because he agreed or disagreed, just because he'd been raised to let a person finish their thought before giving them none of his. She said it twice, snares, twice more, something big. He said nothing. Back home, he moved quieter than usual. The woods had taken on that charged hush, like when snow's about to fall. It wasn't just the wind or the weight of clouds. It was something behind the trees, just out of reach. That night he sat on the porch again. No fire, no blanket. Just him and the creak of the swing under his weight. And he felt it. Something watching from the tree line. Not hiding, not threatening, just there, holding space. Like a neighbor who didn't want to talk, only to be near. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the shift of air, in the pause between breaths, in the way his skin prickled along the back of his neck, not out of fear, but awareness. When he rose and went inside, he closed the door slow. Not to lock something out, but to leave the moment intact. Next morning he found nothing on the porch. No blanket this time, no sticks. Just the quiet. But out by the chopping block, something, had left a pile of split kindling. Not tossed together, stacked, from thinnest to thickest. Neat as any seasoned woodsman could have done. He stood over it a long while, not touching it, just letting it sink in. He placed a few ears of roasted corn in a shallow basket and left them at the edge of the woods. No note, no words, just the offering of someone who finally understood the language of silence. Later that week, at the edge of town, he passed Tess again. She said she'd seen something strange near the creek. Marks on a tree, long and fresh. Not clawed, scraped, like metal dragging across bark. She said the grass along the creek bank looked pressed down, like something heavy had been pulled across it. She looked at him like she wanted him to say it wasn't true. He didn't. He told her not to walk alone, not for a while. She tilted her head the way curious people do when they don't quite believe you but want to remember what you said just in case. Then she nodded, just once, and walked away. That evening the sun went down in streaks of rust and ash, and the first real chill of the season settled in. Caleb sat at his table again, turning his cup in his hand, not drinking. Out beyond the window something moved past the tree line. Slow, intentional. He could feel it in his ribs more than see it. A presence large enough to carry the forest's breath with it. He didn't light the lantern. He didn't reach for the rifle. He just listened. And when he finally stepped out onto the porch, he found 3 more stacks of wood. This time, bundled with twine. 1 thin, 1 medium, 1 thick. He crouched beside them, the porch boards groaning under his weight, and saw something else. A small smudge on the top log. Not blood, not dirt. Just a print. Big. Too big. But human-shaped. Not quite right. Not wrong enough to run from either. He stood, took a slow breath, and looked out into the dark where the trees stood waiting. There was nothing to see. Only the sense of something having just turned away. Something choosing distance. Something choosing restraint. That night, as he closed the cabin door, he let his hand rest on the latch a moment longer. The kind of pause that says you see the space between one world and another, and you're willing to stand in it, if only so both sides know they're not alone. The forest held its breath a little tighter, and Caleb, though no younger, no stronger, felt less like a man living alone, and more like someone expected. Something had started, and it hadn't said a word, but it had spoken all the same. The crickets had started before the cicadas that year. Caleb noticed it in the quiet way he noticed most things, early, without needing to say it out loud. It was the first warm spell of June, the kind that soaked the trees in gold before the air turned heavy. He stood on the porch in the same boots he wore every morning, coffee cooling in his hand, listening. The woods felt different again, not louder, just more awake. He'd seen the birds shift direction in the evening, seen the way the deer started using new paths. But it was something else now. That feeling in the chest, like someone was watching, not in malice, but in wait. That morning, across the clearing, between 2 old pines that leaned inward like gossiping men, he saw it, still, upright, half-shrouded by distance, taller than he remembered, or maybe just more sure of itself. The same fur, dark and uneven, touched with that silver light the morning gave to things that lived out of reach. Its shoulders were broad but not aggressive, its posture careful, like it knew how its presence carried weight. And it didn't move, just tilted its head slightly, the way a dog does when it's heard something familiar, then turned and walked back into the woods without sound. There are invitations that don't come with words. Caleb didn't rush. He didn't even finish his coffee. He set the cup down, grabbed the oil lamp from the hook, shrugged into his jacket, and stepped off the porch like he was heading into town for nails. The path it had taken wasn't marked, not with broken branches or boot tracks, but he knew it anyway, the way one knows the difference between coincidence and intent. The forest opened slow, pine needles soft underfoot, ferns curling toward him like cautious greetings. Roots spread out across the dirt like ancient hands. Every so often, he'd see a pause up ahead, just the suggestion of something waiting. But by the time he reached it, it was gone. They led him through a corridor of cedar and silence until the trees peeled back into a windless hollow. It wasn't a meadow. It was a room, protected, watched over. The way the earth curved around it told him it had been used long before he ever showed up. In the middle, 5, maybe 6, figures sat around the dying heart of a fire, just embers now, no smoke. They didn't speak. They didn't flinch. They didn't offer welcome, but they didn't close him out either. Each shape was different. Some broader, some leaner, one small enough that he might have mistaken it for a person on their knees, but all still, all aware, like rocks that breathe. The one he'd saved stood a little ways off from the others. It stepped forward, not fast, not cautious, just deliberate. In the fading light, its features held more than just shape. There was something in the way it carried itself, like it had spent time thinking about this moment. It stopped just shy of reaching Caleb. Then, slowly, it brought its large hand to its chest, held it there a second, then extended it toward him, not to touch, not to demand, just to offer the space between. Caleb didn't know what to call the gesture, but he knew what it meant. He pressed his palm against his own chest, nodded, a little bow. That was enough. Behind the creature, one of the others exhaled, a long, tired breath. Not sad, not restless, just the sound of someone letting something old go. The fire pit held only red coals now. Around it, none of them moved much, but they weren't statues. One of them adjusted slightly, leaned into an elbow. Another turned their face just enough for the eye to catch the shape of it. Not animal, not fully human either. Like someone had carved familiarity into something wilder. Their hair moved with the breeze like it had weight. Their eyes didn't flash like a predator's. They softened when they landed on him, like recognition, not threat. He didn't speak. He didn't try. He just stood there, feeling the way the earth cradled this hollow like a secret it had kept for too long. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. And then, barely there, a sound broke through. Metal, a squeak, a drag. Somewhere off past the ridge, past the sheltering trees, something moved that didn't belong. Not wind, not bird, not anything native. It was a wrong sound, a reminder. Caleb turned his head slightly, not enough to break the moment, but enough to listen. He saw it then too, in the way one of the larger creatures tensed, shoulders drawn, breath paused. They'd heard it too, and they remembered. No one moved to check. No one ran. The sound faded, like someone dragging a metal sled through brush, then deciding not to. Caleb's fingers twitched at his side, not in fear, in calculation. He looked back at the one he'd pulled from the mud. Its eyes hadn't left him. There was no demand in them, just a kind of shared knowing that ran deeper than names. When he turned to go, no one followed. But he felt them watching, not to guard, but to witness, to make sure he left through the same path he had entered. He walked slower on the way back. The air had changed, not cooler, but charged. He didn't look over his shoulder, didn't need to. The woods were never truly behind you once you'd been allowed to walk their private roads. Back at the cabin, dusk had wrapped itself around the porch like a shawl. The crickets had quieted again, like they too were waiting. Caleb set the lamp down, wiped the sweat from his neck, and stared out toward the trees. The sound of metal hadn't left him, not its tone, not the direction it came from. He knew what it meant, and he knew the hollow knew it too. He sat on the edge of the porch, fingers tapping his knee in a rhythm only he could hear. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. But Caleb didn't answer. He was already hearing something else, something quieter. The way the forest shifts when it's no longer sure who's walking through it, and who's waiting to be found. By midsummer, the heat settled into the soil like it meant to stay, curling the edges of old leaves and thickening the air until even the birds slowed down. Caleb moved quieter in those days, not because he was hiding, but because the woods had started listening again. And sometimes it's better to let the trees speak first. One afternoon, after hauling a fresh bundle of firewood to the shed, he noticed something strange along the back trail. Near a stump he knew like the back of his hand, something new had taken hold. An imprint, not of feet, but of wire. A thin rust-colored ring cut through the moss, no wider than a wrist, but at the right height for a man's leg. He didn't crouch to examine it, didn't take out a knife to test it. He just stared, then slowly stepped back and turned toward the cabin. A snare leaves a shape in the earth long after it's gone, and he knew a trap laid once never shows up alone. Down in town, the diner still rattled with ceiling fans too tired to do their job. In the back booth near the window, a kid sat alone, picking at a bowl of chili like he was waiting for the rest of his life to start. Micah Dodd, 13, gangly, always half lost in some thought no one else could follow. He wasn't a loud kid, but he paid attention. The kind who noticed when his dog stopped barking and the cage door was left open with no sign of struggle. The kind who looked at the woods not with fear, but with the kind of curiosity that gets people into trouble. Caleb watched him from the counter, sipping weak coffee, waiting. When Micah came over to ask if he'd ever seen anything strange out there, Caleb just shrugged, said something vague about raccoons and too much imagination. But he didn't stop the boy when he sat down, didn't shoo him away when he started talking about what the neighbors said, about something big, something that could lift a latch without using claws. That evening, as the sky dulled into gold, Caleb saw the boy again. Near the edge of his property, boots too clean, posture too eager, he was walking the tree line like he'd read about it in a book. Caleb was halfway through a check on the fence when he spotted him about to step into something he shouldn't. A loop of wire, nearly invisible under the leaf cover, stretched tight between two roots. One more step and the boy would have been yanked clean off his feet. Caleb's arm shot out fast and caught him by the shoulder, hard enough to stop him cold. Micah's breath hitched, his eyes wide, hand still hovering mid-air like he couldn't decide whether to run or apologize. Caleb didn't scold, just looked at him with a weight that didn't need words. The boy nodded, slowly, then clung to the back of Caleb's shirt like a kid half his age until they were back inside the fence line. The grip didn't let go until Caleb set him down on the porch and poured a glass of water without being asked. That night, as the crickets buzzed low and steady, Caleb found something new waiting for him. Right at the edge of the porch, 3 bundles of firewood, each stacked in order from smallest to largest, the twine tied neat, too neat for human hands. It wasn't the offering that caught him. It was the shape, the symmetry. Whoever had done it wasn't copying out of mimicry. They were watching, learning, choosing the harmless things and doing them right. He stared at the bundles a long while before placing 3 ears of corn beside them, boiled earlier that day, still warm inside. When Tess showed up the next morning with a clipboard and a look in her eye like she had something to prove, Caleb didn't bother playing dumb. She said she'd seen something down near the creek, fresh metal gouges on a tree, and a long drag in the grass like someone had pulled a sled through. She said it didn't make sense because there wasn't anything missing. But Caleb knew better. Some traps don't aim to catch. Some traps aim to test. He told her not to walk alone. She smiled like it was cute, then nodded when he didn't smile back. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again, brought with it that sticky silence that clings to the back of your neck when the woods are thinking. Caleb stepped outside and scanned the tree line, but there was nothing visible. Just the kind of stillness that presses down like a held breath. He didn't go back inside. He sat on the porch with the lantern unlit, the fire pit cold. He waited. Micah came by the next day, this time on foot, no bike, no backpack, just him. Said he couldn't sleep, said the woods were too quiet lately. Caleb asked if his parents knew where he was. Micah said they didn't ask anymore. Caleb didn't press. He handed the boy a biscuit from the tin on the counter and said nothing else. Sometimes knowing who's missing from a house is easier than knowing who's watching from the trees. That night, the air turned thick again. The kind of heavy where sound travels wrong, like it's being carried in syrup. Caleb sat up long past midnight, the lantern burning low. Every now and then, he'd catch a movement outside. Not close, just there. A shift in the pattern of the leaves, a hesitation in the breeze. He opened the door just before dawn, stepping out slow. The porch creaked like it was warning him. Down near the tree line, something had changed. One of the fence posts leaned sideways, not broken, just bent. Like someone had paused to lean against it, curious but unsure. He walked to it, found a mark on the top rail, a handprint, faint, wide, not human, but close. The sun broke through the trees a moment later, and for the first time in weeks, Caleb looked up and didn't feel alone. Not in the usual way. There was weight in the woods now. Something watching, yes, but also waiting. Waiting to see if he'd still be standing when the rest of it came back around. And somewhere deep in the soil beneath his boots, the earth felt like it was starting to remember what it used to mean when two kinds of people stood on the same ground without trying to own it. He didn't speak that morning, didn't write it down. Just stood there, one hand resting on the top of the post, the other brushing the edge of the rope he kept tied at his belt. Because some things don't need retelling. Not yet. Under the slow-turning sky of early autumn, the Ouachita woods shifted color like an old quilt being aired out. Patches of honey, rust, and deep red bleeding through the greens. The wind picked up now and then, but never enough to feel like warning. Just the kind of breeze that nudges memory loose. Caleb stood at the edge of the ridge with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the tree line with the tired patience of someone waiting for a sound he knew might not come. The trails had gone quiet again. Not dead, just quiet. And he'd learned enough not to mistake that stillness for safety. He followed the familiar footpath without meaning to, the one that led to the hollow hidden deeper in the woods, where the trees grew close and the light pooled low. He didn't carry anything with him except the weight in his chest and a small drawstring pouch with nothing inside. The forest let him pass. No crack of twigs, no startled deer. Just his own boots against damp leaves and the occasional buzz of a late summer fly that hadn't yet given up the season. When he reached the clearing, it didn't surprise him that they were already there. 5 of them. Some standing, some crouched like shadows resting on haunches. They didn't move to greet him. They didn't turn away either. And that was all the welcome he needed. The one he knew best, the young one he'd dragged from the mud months ago, stood off to the right, half lit by the broken sunlight filtering through the amber canopy. Taller now, straighter, but his eyes still held that same weary kindness. Like he remembered what it meant to be helped and hadn't stopped carrying the debt. Caleb didn't speak. He just gave a slight nod and stepped forward. This time, it wasn't about observation. It was about understanding. Because this time, there was a child. No one pointed, no one introduced. But it was clear enough. The small figure clung to the fur of the older one, its mother most likely, barely peeking out from beneath the long, matted hair draped over her chest. It couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall. Big round eyes the color of polished walnut, fingers long and delicate, curled into the folds of her fur like tiny roots hanging on through wind. One of the adults stepped forward and placed a hand on the child's brow. Not with force, with reverence. The way some people press palms to gravestones, not to mourn, but to remember. The child closed its eyes, leaned into the touch for a moment, and then reached one uncertain hand toward Caleb. Not fully out, not fully back, just hovering in the space between instinct and trust. Caleb didn't move, didn't dare reach. He simply lowered his head a little, like someone passing the threshold of a stranger's home. His breath fogged slightly in the cool shade, though the air was still and dry. It smelled of pine and earth, with a faint musk of something older, something not quite animal, not quite human, something that lived in the bones of this land longer than any settler ever did. The silence lasted longer this time, not awkward, sacred, a pause to feel, not to think. And then he saw it, off beyond the circle, just past the tree line. The light struck something low in the brush. Not gold, not green, but silver. Dull. Out of place. He narrowed his eyes. It was half buried in dry leaves. A glint of metal in the wrong kind of shape. Too straight, too clean, too deliberate. He didn't step closer. He didn't need to. The memory surfaced like a bruise coming up slow. The sound he'd heard weeks ago, like a tool dragging through brush, the way one of the older figures had stiffened. And he knew what it was. A trap. Maybe not yet armed, maybe not yet triggered, but left there by a hand with bad intentions. His jaw tightened. One of the figures to his left shifted, just enough to let him know they saw it too. He breathed deep through his nose, let the air scrape the back of his throat like smoke. There was nothing to say, nothing to be done, not right here, not now. He turned back to the group, his eyes landing once more on the child who now stood on its own, barely knee-high to its mother but already sturdy. There was a dignity in the way it held still, a stillness that came from watching more than playing. Caleb suddenly understood something else. The mud pit from the spring, the one where he'd found the young male, barely breathing. That path hadn't been random. It was part of a route, a worn trail, not just for one, for many, and the broken stakes he'd found there weren't driftwood or storm debris. They were planted, purposeful, human hands trying to steer something ancient into the wrong kind of story. His stomach turned, but his face stayed steady. He felt the cold edge of resolve settle behind his ribs like a blade laid flat and hidden. He didn't tell them what he saw. He didn't need to. They'd already seen it, probably long before he did. But the fact that they'd let him see it at all, that meant something. As he turned to leave, the young one he'd saved stepped forward and did something he hadn't done before. He placed a single hand on Caleb's shoulder, just for a second, then let go. It wasn't affection. It wasn't farewell. It was acknowledgement, maybe even permission. Caleb walked home under a sky that looked too bright for what he carried now. The trees shifted overhead like gossiping ghosts, and the wind felt colder than it should have in early October. He didn't look back. He didn't check his pace, but his ears stayed open the whole way. By the time he reached the cabin, the light was falling low across the porch. He stepped inside, poured himself water from the tin jug on the counter, and stood for a long while without drinking. Then he pulled out the map, hand-drawn, soft with age, and traced his finger along the route he now understood better than ever. The patrol trail, the mud pit, the hollows, the ridges. He marked the spot where the trap had been left, then the spot where the child had stood. He sat down with his back to the wall and exhaled slow. Somewhere in those woods, someone else was setting things into motion, not out of hunger, not out of fear, but out of control. And Caleb knew then what kind of man left steel in a place meant for silence. There would be more traps. There would be more signs. But for now, the woods still held. And under their breath, the trees kept their secrets just long enough to let the man prepare. The leaves turned brittle in late October, dry and whispering, crunching underfoot like thin shells when Caleb walked the perimeter just after dawn. There was a restless hush in the woods that didn't belong to animals anymore. It belonged to people, people who came quiet, not because they respected the land, but because they didn't want it to notice them. The air smelled sharper now, like steel left out too long in the cold, and he could feel it in the back of his neck, the way the woods didn't breathe the same when something wrong had passed through. He didn't carry a gun, never had use for one, but he'd started carrying a long stick cut from hickory, not to fight with, but to feel the ground before he stepped. He was careful about where he went, not out of fear, but out of understanding. There were places now that needed gentler feet. That morning he followed a trail he'd half memorized weeks ago, the one near the ravine, where the brush grew thicker and the rocks turned black from rain. He moved slow. Each time he spotted a broken branch, he paused, not because it was broken, but because it was too clean. No fray, no splinter, just snapped. Deliberate, human. 30 yards in, behind a crooked birch that leaned toward the hill, he found the first one, a stash, camouflaged poorly with a few pine boughs, probably meant to be temporary. Inside, a coil of snare wire, rusted but strong, a pair of pliers with the grip wrapped in blue tape, and a glass jar of oil, kerosene or something nastier. He crouched beside it, one knee in the moss, hand on his chin. There were prints nearby, not boot tracks, knee prints. Whoever left this had squatted low, took their time, didn't panic. He didn't touch the jar. He didn't want the scent on his hands. But he took the wire, unraveled it carefully, bent each loop until it crimped and lost its shape. He walked 20 yards farther, found a spot where the mud was soft and the roots deep, and pushed it down into the earth. Covered it with dead leaves, just enough to hide it from lazy eyes, but not enough for it to disappear. That wasn't the only stash he found. By late afternoon, he'd uncovered 3 more, each one with slight differences. One had jerky stuffed into a plastic bag. Another had a hacksaw that looked older than the man using it. Every time the pattern was the same, hidden just off the natural paths, just outside where hikers would go. But not deep enough for deer. It wasn't hunting, it was baiting. He wasn't reckless. He didn't destroy the camps, just broke the tools, let the brush reclaim them. One snare at a time, not to make war, but to sweep the front porch before the storm arrived. Later, when the sky turned gray and the clouds folded close to the ridgeline, he passed by the edge of town to fill up his kerosene and check on a box of nails he'd ordered weeks ago. At the hardware store, folks didn't say much unless they had something to brag about. Most of them didn't ask where he lived. They just nodded like they'd known him longer than they had. That's where he ran into Mabel Crane, the widow with the faded blue eyes and the voice that always carried too far in small rooms. She told him a story without prompting. Said once, when she was barely 18, she'd gotten lost off a fire road west of Bear Gap. Walked for half a day without a compass. She said she was crying by the time the sun started to dip. But someone, no, something, walked ahead of her. Slow, big, broad-shouldered. Just far enough not to scare her. Said every time she stopped, it stopped. Said she thought she'd imagined it. Until it led her straight back to the trailhead and disappeared without a sound. She looked at Caleb then like she knew something. Something he hadn't said out loud. She didn't press. Just placed her hand on his forearm for a second and said, "When you're trusted with something, don't betray it. Some debts don't expire." That night, the wind rose. Not loud, but with pressure. Like something unseen was moving too quickly across open fields. Caleb stepped outside with his lantern, the glass fogged from the sudden cold. He walked the edge of his clearing, past the shed, past the split wood, and listened. Not for voices, for absence. Because sometimes it's the missing sounds that mean more. He caught the first scent on the far side of the property. Burnt oil, faint but recent. It didn't drift. It clung. He stepped lightly, followed it toward the ridge. In the distance, maybe 50 yards, orange flickers moved between the trunks. Not like campfires, more like torches, handheld, Controlled, moving. He stayed low, didn't get close. Just watched the way the flames danced behind tree cover. Silent, coordinated, like a search party without the mercy. He counted 3, maybe 4. Didn't hear talking. Only the faint grind of boots on leaf litter and the occasional click of metal against metal. These weren't teenagers out for mischief. These were men who came prepared for something they didn't understand. He turned back without a sound. No need to confront. Not yet. He marked the time by the stars. Knew he had 20 minutes to loop around the west side and check the path near the cedar line. In the morning, he found a new snare set just under the root arch where the young one often stepped. The wire was fresh, the knot precise. It had been placed overnight. He didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He just stared at it for a long time, chest still, fingers curled. Then he took it apart. Same way he always did. Bent it out of shape, buried it, pressed his palm into the dirt like a closing prayer. Back at the cabin, he sat at his table with his old leather notebook in front of him. Open to a blank page, but he couldn't write yet. The pen stayed dry in his fingers. Sometimes the truth takes longer to dry than ink. He sat that way until the light changed, until the wind shifted and the sky went from pewter to slate. Then he closed the book without a word and stepped back out into the cold. Somewhere in the woods, someone had set a challenge. Not just to him, but to something older, quieter, and far more patient. And whatever was coming next, Caleb knew. It wouldn't knock. It would wait. Then take. The cold that came with December didn't whisper this time. It bit. Hard. The kind that got into joints and under nails and sat heavy in your lungs like old sorrow. Caleb stood still at the edge of the tree line before first light, the hem of his coat stiff with frost, breath breaking white against the darkness. No lantern, no rifle, just the weight of what he knew and the light grip of the hickory walking stick he never left behind now. He waited by the ridge just off the old cedar line, where the path dipped near the creek and curved toward the downed pine. That's where they'd set the last one. He'd uncoiled it slowly, checked for scent. Clean, no bait. Just a wire loop meant to strangle from the ankle up, hidden under fallen needles in the bend of the trunk. It was placed right where the younger one usually passed through. Whoever left it wasn't hunting food. They were aiming for something that walked like a man. This morning, Caleb didn't wait by the trap. He stood just beyond it, hidden in the shadow of a thick spruce, the cold leaching into his bones. He knew it wouldn't be long. When you wreck a man's work, he always comes back to check who's been sweeping behind him. The woods held their breath. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of wet snow packing under boots. Then the first flicker of movement. Shoulders hunched, back bowed. A man in a heavy coat, too long in the sleeves, dragging a boot slightly like he'd twisted it once and never let it heal. The stink of old whiskey and cheap tobacco drifted in first, sharp against the morning air. Caleb didn't move. Watched him crouch beside the trap, brush away the snow, fingers fumbling as he reset the wire with a grunt of frustration. But then something else shifted. Behind him, maybe 20 feet off, the brittle crunch of another step. Smaller, too light for a man. Caleb's chest went tight. Micah. The kid's breath came too fast, too close. Caleb turned just enough to see the shape. Thin jacket, no hat, eyes too wide, limbs half tucked into himself. He'd followed again, and this time he was out of place, out of time. The poacher heard it too. He straightened, turned fast, gun halfway to his shoulder before his face even cleared the dark. The boy flinched, stumbled on a root slick with frost, boots slipping, arms flailing to stay upright. That barrel found him fast, steadied too quick for a man that drunk. Caleb stepped forward, heart pounding so loud it swallowed the space between them. But someone else moved first. From the trees behind, the boy came a shape-like shadow-breaking form. Shoulders as broad as a barn door. Hair soaked with melted snow, clinging to its arms and brow like the forest had dressed it in mourning. The young one, grown taller, leaner, but still recognizable, stepped forward without a sound. No growl, no lunge, just presence. And then, both arms lifted slowly, not in threat, in defense. One massive arm swept between Micah and the poacher, the hand open and low like a curtain being drawn across a window. The man froze, not because of what stood there, but because of what it didn't do. It didn't charge, didn't scream. It didn't play the monster he'd spent his nights imagining. It shielded the boy, stepped in front of him like a brother, or a father, or a soldier standing in a doorway that couldn't be shut. Caleb's voice came out dry and low, but strong enough to cut through. "You don't need to do this." He took another step, arms out from his sides, palms up. Not a demand, not a challenge. Just a man asking another to take the weight off before he crushed himself with it. The poacher blinked. Gun still aimed. Finger tightening, then loosening. Confused by the image in front of him, by the silence in the trees, by the truth he hadn't prepared to see. This wasn't a beast. It wasn't prey. It was something with eyes, with memory, with a choice. And in that moment, he lost the story he'd been telling himself. That everything in these woods could be owned or gutted or sold. Because now there was a boy beneath that outstretched arm. Not screaming, not hiding, just breathing. And whatever hatred he'd held in his gut for whatever walked through these trees at night, it had no room left to stand. The poacher lowered the rifle, didn't drop it, just let it drift downward, like it had grown too heavy to hold. Then he did something Caleb didn't expect. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled something small and metallic, and threw it to the dirt. It hit hard, skidded, a snare loop, already bent open. He didn't say anything, just turned, walked slow, like a man who realized he hadn't brought enough fire to the cold. His steps trailed away until even the frost stopped answering. Micah stood frozen, his mouth half open, eyes locked on the figure still standing in front of him. Caleb walked over, placed one hand on the boy's shoulder and squeezed once. The young one still hadn't moved. Then, slow as breath, he dropped his arms, turned his face toward Caleb, not with fear, not with relief, just that same worn patience, like he'd known it would come to this. Caleb nodded once. The snow started falling again, light at first, then steadier, like the sky was trying to bury the moment before it had time to settle. They didn't stay long after that. The boy followed Caleb back down the ridge, boots scraping the dirt like he'd aged a year in an hour. Neither of them spoke. The cold didn't lift, but it didn't bite quite as deep either. At the edge of the clearing, just before stepping onto the porch, Caleb glanced back. The young one was gone, but the trees held a shape, a curve in the shadows where something had stood. Guarded, chosen. Caleb didn't write it down that night. He didn't need to. Some things don't need names, only memory, only return. And somewhere in the dark, he knew, the next trap wouldn't come in the form of wire, but in silence, in stories, in choices made by men who had seen mercy and didn't know how to carry it. The winter laid itself over Ouachita like a wool blanket worn too thin at the edges, soft in places, but heavy in the wrong ones. By mid-January, the forest had quieted in a way Caleb hadn't felt since before the first thaw of spring the year before. Not just winter quiet, not the hush of sleeping roots or hibernating deer. This was different. Like the land itself had drawn a long breath and was holding it, waiting to see what stayed and what let go. He moved slower now, not from pain, but from purpose. Even the snow seemed to recognize his presence, crunching less beneath his boots as he stepped off the porch that morning. A dusting had come in overnight, just enough to powder the world in stillness. The sky above was colorless, and the air carried no scent. But when he bent to tie his laces, he noticed it. A single set of tracks, not deep, not old, leading from the tree line to the base of his steps, then stopping. No signs of distress, no disturbance, just presence. And folded beside them, near the bottom step, was an olive-green army blanket, worn and pilled from years of use, but clean, and folded so perfectly it could have come straight from his own footlocker, the same one he'd left out during that first spring storm. Next to it were 3 bundles of firewood, arranged smallest to largest, tight, dry, not random. Someone had been watching long enough to know how he worked, not just mimicking, participating, offering. He didn't touch anything at first, just stood there with his hand on the door frame, looking down like the porch had whispered something he wasn't sure he believed. Then slowly, he knelt, ran his fingers across the edge of the top bundle. No frost. It had been dropped not long before he stepped out. He looked out toward the tree line. Nothing moved, but the quiet wasn't empty. It was full of a kind of peace he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Inside, the fire still held its heat from the night. He didn't stoke it. He didn't write in the notebook. He just stood at the window, mug in hand, letting the steam blur his vision until the trees looked like shadows of themselves. Later that day, he walked back to the old hollow. The snow here lay untouched, a soft sheet across the forest floor. He didn't expect to see anyone. He didn't need to. He just wanted to feel it again. That sense that something lived deeper in the woods than fear. And when he reached the center, he found it. Empty, yes, but not abandoned. The coals had long since cooled, but the ring of stones remained. Tight, maintained. 2 were newer, placed with care. And beside the largest one, a feather. Dark, long, laid out like an offering or a note. He didn't pick it up, just crouched beside it, hands resting on his knees, letting his breath cloud around him and rise into the stillness above. He spoke then, not loudly, just a sentence, dropped like a stone into a lake. "You held your side." Nothing answered, but something heard. Back at the cabin, he finally opened the notebook. The page from weeks ago still blank. He turned it, started fresh. "Spring of last year, I pulled a body out of the mud. I thought I was the one doing the saving. Turns out, they pulled me out of something thicker, lonelier. Turns out, I wasn't the only one trying not to vanish." He let the pen rest there. Snow kept falling. The days passed without event, but not without meaning. The forest had settled into its new rhythm. Some mornings he'd find small things at the edge of the yard. A piece of birch bark with a smoothed edge, a stone carved with an odd groove, a braid of dried grass no animal would ever make. None of them loud, all of them kind. And sometimes, just after dusk, he'd feel it again. A shape beyond the last cedar, standing, watching, not waiting for him, just letting him know they were still here. The cold grew sharper as February crept closer. But Caleb didn't feel it the same way anymore. He'd grown into the silence, let it wrap around him like a second skin. Micah came by less often now, but when he did, he'd always stop at the porch first. Check for new tracks. Never said it aloud, but Caleb could tell the boy was looking for something more than just footprints. A sign, a message, a confirmation that the things they'd seen weren't dreams or warnings, but bonds. And one night after dinner, the boy asked him quietly, "Do you think they're still out there?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The sky above was black with stars, the air so still it felt like a held breath. He raised his hand and pressed it flat to his chest. Didn't say a word. Micah joined him a second later. Said nothing either. They stood together, eyes on the woods, not looking for monsters, just remembering who stood between the trap and the child, and what it meant to be seen. The snow didn't last past March. The melt came fast and low, turning paths into rivers and rivers into warnings. But even as the mud returned and the branches shed their frost, the memory stayed of what had stepped forward without violence, of what had turned protection into language. Caleb didn't write much after that, just lived. Chopped wood, fixed a hinge on the shed door, shared soup with a neighbor who never asked why he'd stopped coming to church. He wasn't hiding. He just belonged somewhere now, even if it didn't have a name, even if no one ever saw it again. And on the last day of winter, he found one more thing on the porch. A carved piece of wood, smoothed with hands that knew how to listen. No markings, no message, but it looked a lot like a door. Or maybe just the space where one used to be. He placed it on the mantel. Didn't explain it. Didn't have to. Some stories don't close. They step back and watch. There are stories that don't end so much as they step aside, quietly, gently, to make room for silence. And in that silence, something lingers. A breath, a choice, a trace of kindness left behind like footprints in the snow, slowly fading but never really gone. Some connections aren't loud. They're not forged in ceremony or bound by words. They're made in gestures. A folded blanket, a shared fire, an arm raised not to strike, but to shield. And maybe that's what matters most. Not the noise we make, but the grace we give. In a world that's always rushing to prove something, there's power in restraint, in mercy, in standing still when every instinct tells you to run. Because sometimes it's not the strongest who survive, but the gentlest, not the loudest who lead, but the ones who listen without needing to be heard. When we choose compassion over fear, when we protect instead of possess, we become more than what we were. We become something worthy of trust, and trust, once earned, doesn't need to speak. It lives in the spaces between gestures, in the care we offer without asking for anything back. It's easy to forget, especially in these times, that there is still good in the quiet, still beauty in the unseen, that not everything sacred comes with explanation, and not every truth demands proof. Some things exist simply because someone chose to believe, chose to reach out across a divide that was never meant to be crossed, and in doing so, turned fear into understanding. If this story found you, maybe it's because a part of you already knew what it was trying to say, that even in the loneliest places, connection is possible, that even in the deepest dark, something watches, not to harm, but to hope. Thank you for walking with us through this journey. If it moved you, even just a little, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done? What would you leave at the edge of the woods if you knew someone kind might find it? Leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. Tap the like if you felt something. Subscribe if you believe there are still stories worth hearing, especially the ones told in silence. Until next time, stay warm, stay kind, and remember, sometimes the ones who vanish aren't lost. They're just choosing to live where the rest of us forgot to look.